Hang on. Hold on. I'm not doing this with you.
I'll be dumb.
Okay? Nothing's gonna happen. Okay?
Why I have to be treated like this?
Well, you started pulling away, and I don't like that. Okay?
Why do I have to be treated like this?
Because don't move.
Why am I treated like this?
I'm trying.
Please.
Just relax. Just relax.
There we go.
Okay, just relax.
She was walking down the middle of the street. No shoes, no clothes, no sense of where she was or what she had just done. It was an ordinary Tuesday in Tallahassee, Florida. The sun was already up. Birds were already singing. Neighbors were already heading to work, coffee in hand, radios on. Normal morning, normal world. And then they saw her. A woman, barefoot, completely naked, moving through the neighborhood as if she were simply out for a stroll. Her eyes were open but empty. Her mouth was moving but no words were coming out. At least not words anyone could understand. Someone called 911. They assumed she needed help. They were right, but not in the way anyone imagined. When police arrived on the scene and escorted this woman home, what they found inside that house would stop even seasoned officers in their tracks. It was not just a crime scene. It was something that none of them had ever seen before. Something that none of them would ever forget. Her name was Earleen Tucker. She was 58 years old, and inside that house on an unremarkable street in Tallahassee, Florida, lay the body of her mother, along with a piece of her mother's heart. This is the story of what happened. And more importantly, this is the story of how it all led to this moment. How a woman arrived at the front door of something so dark that the justice system itself did not know what to do with her. Stay with me, because this case is unlike anything else. Every story has a before. Before the crime scene, before the yellow tape, before the neighbors standing on their lawns with their hands over their mouths. There was a house, a modest, quiet house in Tallahassee, Florida. The kind of house you drive past every day without noticing. A small yard, a front door that looked like every other front door on the block, curtains in the windows, maybe a mat at the entrance. Inside that house lived two women. Lucille Tucker was the elder. She had lived a long life. By all accounts, she was a woman who had raised her children and done her best. She had made it to a point in life where most people slow down, where most people get to rest, where the big worries shrink and the small joys grow larger. The warmth of a familiar chair, the rhythm of a familiar television program, the comfort of a home she knew well. She was living with her daughter. Earleen Tucker was 58 years old, the daughter, the woman who would walk out of that house the following morning with nothing on and no clear understanding of what she had just done. What was Earleen's life like before this? What had brought her to this house living with her elderly mother in Tallahassee? The full picture of Earleen Tucker's history is complicated. What is known is that her mental state had been deteriorating for some time. People who knew her, people who had been around her in the months and years leading up to that morning, had noticed changes, escalating strangeness, thoughts that did not connect, words that did not land in the places words are supposed to land. Mental illness does not announce itself at a single moment. It builds, slowly, quietly, and in many cases, the people closest to it are the last to fully understand what is happening. Lucille Tucker was elderly. She was living with her daughter, and somewhere in the background of that domestic arrangement was a danger that neither of them may have fully understood. The night before police were called to that neighborhood, the two women were inside that house together. We do not know the full details of every hour that passed between them. We do not know what was said, what was eaten, what was watched on television. We do not know if Lucille went to bed early or if the two of them sat together in the same room as the night grew darker. What we know is that Lucille Tucker did not survive the night. And what we know is that by morning, Earleen Tucker had left the house without her clothes and was walking down the middle of the road. Somewhere in between those two facts lies the shape of what happened. But before the crime, there was the quiet, there was the house, there was the before. And the before in cases like this is always the part that haunts you most. Not every tragedy is a single decision. Sometimes it is a series of moments. A door that should have been opened. A phone call that should have been made. A system that should have caught something before it became catastrophic. The question that hangs over the Earleen Tucker case is not just what happened inside that house. The question is how it was allowed to get there. Mental illness in this country carries an enormous weight of stigma. Families struggle with it quietly. They rationalize. They explain away the strange behavior. They tell themselves that today is just a bad day, that tomorrow will be better, that it is not as serious as it looks, that everything is fine. They do this because they love the person. They do this because the alternatives are frightening. They do this because the systems that are supposed to help are often fragmented, underfunded, and difficult to navigate. They do this because being honest about the severity of a loved one's mental illness can feel like a betrayal. So they wait, and they watch. And sometimes the situation moves faster than anyone was prepared for. What we know about Earleen Tucker is that her mental state had reached a point of serious crisis. The kind of crisis that required professional intervention. The kind of crisis that cannot be managed at home by a family member without clinical support. Lucille Tucker was an elderly woman living in the same house as her daughter who was experiencing a severe psychotic break. Whether she fully understood the danger of her situation, we cannot say. Whether she had tried to get help for Earleen, we cannot say. Whether Earleen herself had ever been evaluated, diagnosed, or treated before this night, the public record does not make entirely clear. What the public record makes clear is that on the night in question, there was no intervention. There was no one present to interrupt what was unfolding. There was just the two of them inside that house. And somewhere in the darkness of that night, Earleen Tucker's mind went to a place from which there is no simple return. That was the first wrong turn, not made by Earleen alone, not made by Lucille alone, made by a collective failure to recognize that this situation had long since passed the point where it could resolve itself. But that recognition only comes after. It only comes when it is too late to matter. What happened inside that house is horrific. There is no other word for it. And it would be wrong to dress it up in softer language just to make it easier to hear. Part of bearing witness to a case like this is allowing yourself to understand the full weight of what occurred. Earleen Tucker killed her mother. Lucille Tucker sustained a severe wound to her chest. The wound was not accidental. It was not the result of a fall or a collision or any kind of accident. Lucille Tucker was killed by her daughter inside the home they shared. But the act did not stop there. After Lucille Tucker was dead, Earleen Tucker did something that goes beyond what most people can absorb on first hearing. She reached inside her mother's chest. She removed a portion of her mother's heart. The organ was later found on the floor of the home when police arrived. That detail alone stopped investigators. That detail alone separated this case from the long and grim catalog of homicides that law enforcement deals with every year. This was not a case of anger, greed, jealousy, or revenge in any recognizable sense of those words. This was a psychotic act. What was happening inside Earleen Tucker's mind during those moments cannot be known with full certainty, but what the act tells us is that her break from reality was total, absolute. She was not operating in the same world as the rest of us. She was operating inside some internal logic that had entirely replaced the external one. To her, in some dark and fractured version of consciousness, what she was doing made sense. And that in many ways is the most disturbing part of all. Not the act itself, but the fact that inside that act, there was a kind of purpose. She was not simply violent, she was driven. What she was driven by is what the rest of this story tries to explain. And then she walked outside, without her clothes, without her shoes, without any apparent awareness of what she had just done or where she was going. She left the house. She left her mother's body on the floor. She left the organ that had once been a living part of a living woman, and she simply walked out into the morning. That image is almost impossible to reconcile. Most people who commit violence, even violence driven by severe mental illness, exhibit some kind of immediate aftermath behavior. Panic, flight, concealment, the instinct to hide, to run, to cover what has been done. Earleen Tucker did none of those things. She walked down the street. And in doing so, she created the exact chain of events that would bring law enforcement to her door. A neighbor saw her. The neighbor called 911. Dispatchers sent officers to the scene. The officers found her assessed that she needed medical attention, and in the course of doing their job, asked her where she lived. She told them, or she indicated it in some way, because officers escorted her back to the house. And when they walked through that door, the morning changed completely. Inside on the floor lay an organ. It was later identified as part of a human heart. Officers immediately understood that something catastrophic had taken place. They moved through the house. They found Lucille Tucker, elderly, dead, with a severe wound to her chest. The crime scene was immediately secured. More officers arrived. Investigators arrived. Earleen Tucker was taken into custody. There was no struggle. There was no flight. There was no denial. She went with them, quietly, in some way that was almost mechanical. She was wearing whatever someone had managed to put on her in the immediate chaos of the moment, and she was taken in for questioning. What happened in that interrogation room would define the entire course of this case. The interrogation room is where cases are built. It is also occasionally where they are complicated beyond any simple resolution. Police have protocols for these situations. When a suspect is brought in, detectives assess their state. They observe how the person speaks, how they respond to questions, how they carry themselves in the room. These observations matter. They shape the entire approach to the interview. When Earleen Tucker was placed in that interrogation room, it was immediately clear to everyone in that building that they were not dealing with an ordinary situation. She was not calm in the way someone trying to control themselves is calm. She was not agitated in the way someone building a defense is agitated. She was not cooperative in the way an innocent person cooperates, or evasive in the way a guilty person evades. She was somewhere else entirely. She spoke in long, wandering streams that circled back on themselves without arriving anywhere. She made references that did not connect to the questions being asked. She discussed things that had nothing to do with the room she was in or the situation that had brought her there. And sometimes in the middle of all of this, she sang. Not quietly to herself in the way someone hums under stress. She sang, audibly, in the middle of conversations, as if the song was simply the next thing that needed to come out. Officers and detectives are trained to deal with many things. They are trained to deal with liars. They are trained to deal with manipulators. They are trained to deal with people who are frightened, hostile, uncooperative, theatrical. They have tools for all of those situations. But there is no protocol that makes it easy to sit across from someone who has just done what Earleen Tucker did and watch them sing. The dissonance is profound. You are a detective sitting in a room. You know what is in that house. You know what is on that floor. You know what happened to Lucille Tucker, and the woman sitting across from you is humming something. The interrogation continued. Officers continued to ask questions, and in the spaces between the rambling and the singing and the unfocused monologues, Earleen Tucker said things that were deeply significant. She talked about free will. She talked about atomic bombs. She talked about robots. The references seemed random, scattered, symptoms of a mind that had lost its grip on the shared framework that the rest of us use to communicate and navigate the world. But she also talked about her mother. And what she said about her mother would be quoted in every subsequent legal proceeding. She said she killed her mother. Not in the way a person says something they want to confess and be done with. Not in the way someone says something they are ashamed of. Not in the way someone says something they are frightened of. She said it as a fact, matter-of-factly, as if she were reporting the weather or describing what she had eaten for breakfast. She killed her mother. And then because in her mind there was a reason, she explained the reason. She said she took her mother's heart out to examine it. That word, examine. It was not a word that emerged from nowhere. It emerged from a mind that had constructed some kind of internal logic around what it had done. A framework, a justification, not a moral justification in any sense that the outside world could access, but an internal one that made complete sense within the reality she was inhabiting. She had removed her mother's heart to examine it. For what purpose? To check what? To verify what? Earleen Tucker may have offered additional context during the interrogation, but whatever additional context she offered likely arrived embedded in the same stream of disconnected references and free associative leaps that characterized everything else she said in that room. What detectives had on record was a confession, a clear, unambiguous acknowledgement that she had killed her mother and removed a piece of her heart. In a conventional homicide case, a statement like that would be the beginning of the end of the investigation. You have a confession, you have a crime scene, you build your case, and you go to trial. But this was not a conventional homicide case. Because the confession, as significant as it was, came from a woman who was clearly, undeniably operating outside the boundaries of rational thought. The question now was not what she had done. Everyone knew what she had done. The question was what the law was supposed to do with someone who had done something so terrible and yet so clearly did not understand what she had done in any legally meaningful sense. That question would take a long time to resolve. And the process of resolving it would begin with the investigation. When a death occurs and a suspect is already in custody, the investigation shifts its focus. It is no longer about finding the person who did it. It is about building an understanding of everything that surrounds that person. Their history, their mental state, The physical evidence at the scene, the timeline of events, the corroborating details that will hold up not just in court, but in the broader process of determining what kind of legal outcome is appropriate. In the Earleen Tucker case, investigators worked systematically through each layer. The crime scene itself was documented extensively. Officers and forensic technicians photographed and cataloged every element of the interior. The body of Lucille Tucker was processed by the medical examiner, who confirmed the cause of death and provided documentation of the wound to her chest. The organ found on the floor was collected as evidence and examined. It was confirmed to be a portion of a human heart consistent with the wound found on Lucille Tucker's body. There was no ambiguity about what had happened physically. The scene told a clear story, even if the mind behind the story was anything but clear. Investigators also looked into Earleen Tucker's background, her personal history, any prior contact with law enforcement, any prior contact with mental health services, any documentation of her mental state from medical professionals, family members, or others who had been in her life. What they found, to whatever extent it was documented, was consistent with what they had observed in that interrogation room. A woman whose grip on reality had been slipping for some time. Security camera footage from the area was reviewed. Footage of Earleen walking down the street that morning was collected as part of the evidentiary record. That footage, showing a woman in complete psychological disintegration walking through a residential neighborhood in the early morning hours, became one of the defining visual elements of the case. It was submitted to the court. It was reviewed by mental health professionals. It was not by any stretch the image of a woman who had committed a calculated crime. What the investigation ultimately produced was a complete factual record of a tragedy that did not fit neatly into any of the standard categories that the criminal justice system is built to process. Earleen Tucker had killed her mother. She had confessed. The physical evidence was overwhelming. And yet, the legal question of what to do next would hinge on a concept that sits at the intersection of law, medicine, and philosophy. A concept that courts have wrestled with for centuries: sanity and the absence of it. Earleen Tucker was charged with first-degree murder. That is the most serious homicide charge available under Florida law. First-degree murder carries the weight of full criminal intent. It carries the implication that the person who committed the act did so with premeditation, with full awareness of what they were doing and a deliberate decision to do it. The charge was filed based on what had occurred. A person was dead. Another person had admitted to killing her. But the prosecution of that charge immediately ran into the question that had been present from the moment Earleen Tucker was placed in that interrogation room. Was she legally sane at the time of the act? In Florida, as in most jurisdictions in the United States, a defendant can enter a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. This plea does not deny that the act occurred. It asserts that the defendant at the time of the act was suffering from such a severe mental disease or defect that they did not understand the nature of what they were doing or could not distinguish right from wrong. This is a high bar, extraordinarily high. Courts are skeptical of insanity pleas. Juries are skeptical of insanity pleas. The legal standard is not simply that a person was mentally ill. Many people who commit crimes are mentally ill. The standard is that the illness was so severe at the precise moment of the act that it eliminated criminal responsibility entirely. In the case of Earleen Tucker, the evidence was not ambiguous. The crime scene was extraordinary in its nature. The behavior she exhibited in the interrogation room was not the behavior of someone managing their presentation. It was not the behavior of someone deploying a strategy. It was the behavior of someone who had completely lost contact with consensus reality. Mental health professionals who evaluated Earleen Tucker reached conclusions that the court accepted. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was not acquitted in the sense of being released. She was not found innocent in any sense that diminished the gravity of what had happened. She was found to be someone who, at the time she killed her mother and removed a portion of her heart, did not have the mental capacity that the law requires for criminal responsibility to attach. She was remanded to a psychiatric facility for treatment. She would not go to prison. She would go to a secure mental health institution. Whether that felt like justice to anyone watching, to anyone who knew Lucille Tucker, is a question each person has to answer for themselves. The court had spoken, but the weight of what happened in that house did not lift with the verdict. This is the part of the case that requires the most careful attention. Because what happened in that interrogation room when Earleen Tucker was sitting across from detectives and speaking in streams of consciousness about free will and atomic bombs and robots is not simply bizarre. It is clinically legible. To someone trained in psychiatric assessment, the behavior Earleen Tucker exhibited follows a recognizable pattern. Psychosis is not madness in the theatrical sense. It is not uncontrollable rage or inexplicable evil. Psychosis is a medical condition. It is a state in which a person's connection to shared reality is fundamentally disrupted. Their thoughts, their perceptions, their understanding of the world around them, all of it operates according to a completely different set of rules than the ones the rest of us share. When Earleen Tucker talked about free will, it was not random. Inside a psychotic framework, abstract concepts like free will can become central organizing ideas. They can become the lens through which everything else is interpreted. Every interaction, every relationship, every action can be understood through this lens, even if the understanding makes no sense from the outside. When she talked about robots, when she talked about atomic bombs, these were not the ravings of someone performing confusion. These were the symptoms of a mind that had built an entirely self-consistent alternative reality, a reality in which these things were connected, in which they explained something, in which they pointed towards some conclusion that only she could see. And when she said she removed her mother's heart to examine it, she was not trying to shock. She was not being provocative. She was describing something that within the internal logic of her psychotic state made complete sense. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of severe psychosis as a phenomenon. The actions that emerge from it are not random. They have internal logic. They have purpose. They have a kind of terrible coherence that is only visible from inside the experience. From the outside, from the interrogation room, from the legal system, from the neighbors on the street watching a naked woman walk by, there is only the incoherence, only the breach of every norm that we use to hold society together. But from inside that mind, it all made sense. The singing is also significant. People in the grip of severe psychosis sometimes experience something like emotional dysregulation that goes far beyond simple mood swings. Their internal emotional state can become completely decoupled from the external situation they are in. They may laugh at a funeral. They may weep at a comedy. They may sing in an interrogation room where a detective is asking them about their dead mother. It is not callousness. It is not performance. It is the symptom of a mind in which the normal coupling between context and emotional response has been severed. Earleen Tucker, sitting in that room, singing, talking about robots, talking about atomic bombs, was not trying to get away with anything. She was not playing a character. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a mind in total crisis. And that truth, more than any other single element of this case, is what demands that we engage with it, not as a horror story, but as a case study in what happens when mental illness goes untreated until it reaches catastrophic proportions. Her name was Lucille Tucker, and it matters that we stop here and say her name clearly without allowing it to be swallowed by everything else in this story. Lucille Tucker was a mother. She had raised children. She had lived decades. She had seen things change and things stay the same. She had accumulated all the small particular details that make up a human life. Preferences, memories, things she liked to do in the morning, things she thought about before she fell asleep, people she loved, people who loved her. She was an elderly woman, and she was living with her daughter because that is what families sometimes do. They make arrangements. They find solutions. They try to keep the people they love close. She was in her home in a familiar space surrounded by the objects and patterns of her own life. She should have been safe. She was not. And the tragedy of Lucille Tucker's death is not reducible to the legal outcome that followed. It is not resolved by a verdict or a psychiatric commitment order. It does not shrink in the telling. An old woman died in her home at the hands of her daughter. She died violently. She died in a way that no one should die. And she died in a situation that might have been prevented. That last part is where the grief becomes something else. Because Lucille Tucker's death was not inevitable. The chain of events that led to it could have been interrupted. If Earleen Tucker had received appropriate mental health care before her condition reached the point of psychotic break, her mother might still be alive. If the systems in place to identify and support people with severe mental illness had functioned the way they are supposed to function, Lucille Tucker might have had more years, more mornings, more familiar routines, more time. Instead, she was found on the floor of her own home by the officers who came looking for the woman who had been walking down the street. Lucille Tucker deserves to be remembered as more than a victim in someone else's story. She was a person, whole and complicated and real, And her death demands something from us beyond shock. It demands that we ask the question that this case insists on asking. It demands that we look honestly at the conditions that allow tragedies like this one to happen. Cases like this one are not easy to learn from. They resist easy lessons. They resist the kind of reassuring conclusions that wrap a story up cleanly and send the audience home feeling like they understand something. But there are things here that can and should be said out loud. The first is about mental illness and the way we talk about it, or more often the way we do not. Earleen Tucker's mental state did not develop overnight. Psychosis of the severity she exhibited on that morning, the kind that leads a person to commit an act of that nature, and then walk calmly out of the house and down the street, does not arrive suddenly. It builds over weeks, over months, over years. There are signs, there are changes. There are moments when someone who is paying attention might notice that something is seriously wrong. The question is whether anyone noticed, and if they noticed, whether they felt equipped to do anything about it. In this country, mental health care remains one of the most underfunded, undersupported, and stigmatized areas of the entire healthcare system. People who need serious psychiatric intervention often cannot access it. Families who are living with someone in psychological crisis often do not know where to turn. The gap between recognizing that someone needs help and actually being able to get them that help is enormous. And in that gap, people fall. Sometimes they fall in ways that hurt only themselves. And sometimes in cases like this one, they fall in ways that destroy other lives along with their own. The second lesson is about older adults who are living with family members in compromised situations. Elderly people are among the most vulnerable in our society. They often depend on family members for care, companionship, and support. That dependence can be beautiful. It can be a profound expression of love and connection. But it can also create situations in which the vulnerability of the older person is not adequately protected. If an elderly person is living with someone whose mental state is deteriorating, they need someone checking in. They need a system around them that is paying attention. They need neighbors, social workers, community members, anyone who will notice and who will act. Lucille Tucker needed that. She did not get it in time. The third lesson is about the insanity defense itself and the controversy that surrounds it. Public reaction to verdicts like the one in this case is often one of outrage. A person admits to killing someone. There is physical evidence, there is a confession, and they are not sent to prison. For many people, that feels like a failure of justice. But the legal standard for criminal responsibility exists for a reason. Punishment presupposes the capacity for moral understanding. It presupposes that the person being punished understood what they were doing, understood that it was wrong, and chose to do it anyway. When that capacity is absent, not diminished, not compromised, but genuinely absent, the legal tradition of virtually every society in the world recognizes that something other than punishment is required. That recognition is not weakness. It is an acknowledgement of the full complexity of human psychology. It is a refusal to pretend that all actions emerge from the same kind of agency. The debate about where exactly to draw those lines is legitimate and ongoing. But the basic principle that a mind in total psychotic break is a different category than a calculating criminal mind is sound. What is not sound is the system that allowed Earleen Tucker's condition to progress to the point where it became catastrophically dangerous without intervention. That is where the real failure lives, not in the verdict, in everything that came before it. There is a street in Tallahassee, Florida. It looks like most streets in most cities in this country. Houses with yards, curbs, trees, the ordinary visual grammar of American residential life. And somewhere on that street, there was a morning. A morning when a woman walked out of a house in distress and moved down the road as if she had nowhere in particular to go and nothing in particular to carry. She had everything in the world to carry. She did not know it. And that in the end is the image that stays with you from this case. Not the crime scene, not the interrogation room, not the legal proceedings. It is the image of that woman walking, moving through the world in pieces, broken in ways that the people around her had not found a way to address in time. Walking away from something catastrophic with no awareness of what she was walking away from. There is no clean ending to this story. Lucille Tucker is gone. Earleen Tucker is in a secure psychiatric facility being treated for a condition that should have been treated long before it reached this point. A family has been shattered. A community was shaken. A case file sits in a courthouse with a verdict that satisfied no one fully. What do you do with that? The honest answer is that you sit with the discomfort. You resist the urge to turn it into something simple. You let it be as complicated as it actually is, because the complicated version is the true version. And if there is any obligation we have to Lucille Tucker, to the woman who died in her own home on an ordinary night, it is to be honest about the conditions that made her death possible. To look at the gaps in the systems that were supposed to protect her. To ask with real urgency and real intention what we can do differently. Because Earleen Tucker was not the first person to fall through those gaps. And unless something changes, she will not be the last. The street is quiet now. But somewhere in a house that looks just like every other house on a street, that looks just like every other street, someone is struggling. Someone is losing their grip. Someone is surrounded by people who are not sure what to do. Someone is sliding towards something that cannot be undone. The question this case asks all of us is simple. Are we paying attention?